Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. Um, so we're in week 4 of the war, and we hope that our Torah study will bring merit to all of our chayalim and to all of our brethren in Eretz Yisrael. Keep them safe, heal them from their wounds, bring the captives home. We are in the Kuzari in the 4th Ma'amar, the 4th essay, page 434. And let me also just quickly announce that there will be no class next week. I will be, Amir Tzashem, on Tuesday next week, somewhere in the south, and hopefully at an army base at this time next week. So we're going to set up a WhatsApp group to sort of give you regular updates of what I'm doing with pictures and videos. So we'll send out, if you're part of the shul's email, I hope you're all on the shul's email list. We'll send out, or the WhatsApp, the general WhatsApp group. We will send out the link to join that WhatsApp so you can see where we're going. Yeah, okay. I'm leading a group of rabbis this has been organized by the RCA, yeah, Rabbinical Council of America. Yeah. Okay. So let's continue on the bottom of page 434 with the beginning of paragraph 15. So after sort of stating that this distinction that you've drawn between different levels of religious communities that we talked about last week that are either more similar or less similar to Judaism, now we're ready to continue back to our conversation. And our conversation that we had started this whole essay with, the 4th essay, was the different ways that God manifests himself in this world to humanity. And what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to do in the ensuing paragraph is to let us know that God manifests himself to 3 different sectors of humanity in 3 different ways. And I want you to consider the analogy that he creates. But before we read the actual text, I'm going to give you an introduction to this text, not from my own words, but from the words of the late Rav Shlomo Wolbe, who was a great Musarist of the 20th century. And I want to share his ideas with you because he has a whole essay on this next part of the Kuzari. Okay, so let me just share my screen with you. This was published in an obscure sefer for the Abelson family that has a line of rabbis in its family publishing their Torah. And in the back, there are different essays in memory of different members of the Abelson family by people who were close with them, Rabbanim who were close with them. And this was written by Rav Shlomo Wolbe. Okay, so here we are. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Mitaer B'Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to describe for us in the Kuzari et hamadregot hashonot b'yediat Hashem, the different levels in how humanity knows God. V'notein al zeh tziur mo'or hashemesh. What we're going to see momentarily is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi gives a parable to the light of the sun. And he says, V'osif lecha bi'ur b'dimyon me hashemesh shehi echad. We're just quoting now from the text of our text for today, and maybe that's all we need to see is what Rav Wolbe quotes from our text, is that when you think about it, there's really only one sun that is emanating only one kind of light. Ach mitchalfim ma'archot hageshamim hamekablim ota. The only thing that is different are the recipients of that light. Physical objects will differ in how they receive the light from the sun. And this is true even in modern science as well. Va'asher yikabel ota kibul shalem yotzer. He says, when you think about those things which receive the most clear, the objects which receive sunlight best are, actually the word is yoter, shalem yoter, that's a typo, hapininim v'hashoham al hadimyon. The ones that are clearest are, let's say, diamonds, crystals, clear air, and water. Havir, hatzach, v'hamayim. In other words, things that are transparent, the light simply goes through these physical objects. The karei bazeh or nokev. This is what we would call penetrating light. The karei ba'avanim hazakot v'hashtachim aklaliyim. And now, he says, the light that falls on precious stones that glitter and on other shiny surfaces that reflect light, that are not transparent, but actually reflect light in a shiny way. So the light that comes from those would be called or bahir ala dimyon. We would call that shining light, okay? And then uve'etzem uva'aretz v'zulatam or nir'eh. And there's a third kind of light that shines on wood, earth, and other coarse materials that would just be called or nir'eh, a visible light. So if you see light shining on a piece of wood on a dining room table, for example, you see light reflecting, but it's a dull reflection. But clearly the fact that you can even see the table means the table is refracting and reflecting light, okay? That should be obvious. So the point that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is making, he says, Hashemesh hi echad. There's only one sun. Aval yesh chomer hamekabel haor be'otzma rabba, v'yesh chomer shemekabel pachot. But it all depends on the physical object which is receiving and refracting the light. Some physical objects receive the light completely, so that the light just shines through the object. There are other types of objects which reflect the light less. Kacha Kadosh Baruch Hu v'lo chol haaretz kivoda. Well, God is no different from the light of the sun in this respect, that the whole world is filled with Hashem's glory. Kivodo nimtza b'Yerushalayim, London, Paris, New York, ba'ofan shaveh. That God's glory, that the divine presence shines everywhere. In Jerusalem, London, Paris, New York, they're all equal, okay? Sounds like a boutique, right? You know, you see the different names, right? Where the God boutique, it's everywhere. It's in every city. Aval birishmei kvodo yesh hevdel, right? But as far as the impact that this light makes, as far as how it's reflected or received, there's a difference in the different places. LiYerushalayim yeshnan sgulot ruchniot ha'ozrot lahargish. Is that the word? Am I reading it correctly? Lahargish bichvodo yitbarach yoter me'asher b'chol makom acher. He says there are certain things that exist in Jerusalem, certain elements, certain characteristics that exist in the city of Yerushalayim that allow the light of God to be more detectable than in anywhere else in the world. Kimokain yesh hevdelim bein bnei adam. So in the same vein as there are different geographic locations that are either more or less receptive to divinity, so too there are differences among human beings. Uvahem osek keteze b'Kuzari. And so that's really what our paragraph that we're studying today is dealing with. He says there are three categories of human beings. Hanavim asher nafshotam zakot mikablot laoro. So he says prophets who have very pure souls are much more primed to receive God's light. Ya'avor bahem kasher over or hashemesh b'shoham uvipininim. So he says the light passes through the prophet, and he basically is merely a conduit for divinity. So just like light passes through crystals and through glass, right? Zehu ha'or hanokev, that's the penetrating light that just passes through the prophet. And all he's doing is he's just giving off the divine light. Okay? Sha'ar hamadregot shel kabbalat ha'or ein hakuzari mevaer. Now, the other types of light are not as carefully detailed by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Anu nelech bazeh be'ikvotav. So we'll follow in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's footsteps, says Rav Volbi. Uninaseh levaer otan echat echat. And I'll try to explain the other two categories of divine light. We're not going to go into that now, because it's a much longer essay. But I thought that this would make for a very nice introduction to really frame the text of what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is saying. And that really brings us to page 435, subparagraph 3. He says, there's something also after describing the different kinds of light depending upon the object that receives the light. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi says, but there's also plain light, which means without any adjectives, without any modifiers, light is light generically. And now he uses that also to describe the different names of Hashem. So when we talk about divinity that makes itself manifest in this world generically, we use one name to describe that kind of divine presence. We use the name Elohim. That's the name that we use to describe how Hashem is manifest in this world generically. Penetrating light, this or no cave, the light that penetrates through the prophet, that the name that we use for that kind of perceived divinity is the four-letter name of Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Okay? A specific name which describes the relationship between God and the most perfect of earthly creations, namely the prophets whose pure souls receive God's light. His light passes through them as sunlight passes through crystals and rubies. These souls originate from and are hewn from Adam's seed, as explained earlier. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's whole thesis that certain genetic lines are more propitious for prophets than others, which is why, according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, only people descended from our forefathers are capable of prophecy. It's a controversial statement that the Rambam disagrees with, but that's really the way he understands it. This elite group and heart of mankind continue generation after generation, epoch after epoch, and the majority of mankind who were not of this heart emerged as the bark, leaves, sap, and so on to sustain their fruit. The God of this heart of mankind was called Yud Kei Vav Kei. And that's why we, the Jewish people, are unique in our identification of Hashem as the four-letter name of God. It is for this reason that after Hashem finished creation, he attached himself to Adam, and only then was his name Elohim replaced by Hashem Elohim. Remember, we asked the question last week, why is it that the name of God is Elohim throughout the first chapter of Genesis? And we saw Rashi's explanation, and then I briefly mentioned that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's answer to this question is because God's light, as this penetrating light, was only perceivable with the advent of mankind, with Adam HaRishon. And so therefore, you can't even use the four-letter name of Hashem until you introduce Adam, the first human being, into the world. Okay? So that's why we only see the four-letter name after the creation of man. This is what our sages meant when they said he was called by a complete name over a complete universe. The universe was not complete until the advent of Adam, who was the heart of everything that came before him. So, in this way, if we wanted to continue the analogy of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, we would look into Rav Volbi and see how there are other segments of humanity. The truth is that God's light is manifest in everything, even in inanimate creations of Hashem, right? In every single component of creation, you can find God. But then there are differing levels of humanity where God is either more or less manifest. You can look at a flower and see God. That's probably the lowest level of the sort of the more opaque kind of surface. But if you look carefully enough, you can find Hashem in a blade of grass. And then you can see Hashem even more when you put the blade of grass under a microscope and see the complexity of the blade of grass, right? But then there's the shiny light that is not necessarily the type of light that prophets have, or completely share the light of Hashem with the world, like the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei light. But you still have human beings who are capable of shining a light by resembling God in some way or another. And that's really the calling of perhaps most of the Jewish people, is to be, like, if we were to say, what's our goal? What should we be trying? What should we be aspiring for in our aspirations to be good people? And one way of framing it is shine your mirror, reflect the divine light as best as you can. That's really what our goal is. And the more that we can reflect light wherever we go, the more that we can share of this divine light wherever we go. That was really Avraham Avinu's goal. That was his whole project in life. That was his success. Sharing with the rest of the world what it means to be divine, what Hashem's plan, what Hashem wants for the world, the midot of Hashem, right? The way that God acts benevolently with us, we try to share that benevolence with the rest of humanity, with the rest of creation. That's our goal, the way that Rabbi Yehuda Levi frames this. And the more that we can become closer and closer to the messages of the Nevi'im, the more that we can aspire to reach the reflection of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Now, of course, none of us are prophets, and so therefore we don't really reflect the light of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. But it's certainly something that we have received through tradition from our ancestors, that we can aspire that emulation of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. We're supposed to try to emulate that refracting light of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei to the best of our ability. Okay. Questions, comments?
First thing I thought of was that the sun is the same, so like different people respond to Hashem as much as they can or as much as they want to. So the same sun, so the same God will appear to everybody, but how you absorb it and how you react in terms of your, I don't know what you want to call it, holiness or closeness to God or whatever, depends on the person, because they won't all not really transparent or absorbing it, but just how much one person is the perception of their perception or their receptiveness to it.
Mm-hmm.
Theirs.
Yes.
More,
absolutely. The Kli Yakar has a commentary on Parshas Re'eh, where the Torah says, Re'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom beracha uklala. Behold, I'm placing before you today a blessing and a curse. So he asked the question, why does the Torah say the word today? It's every Jew at every time, no matter what day it is, you should consider that there's a blessing and a curse that is placed before us all, depending upon how we behave. And he understands the word hayom as a reference to the daylight, just like we're talking about over here. And he says that this was sort of the Torah's response to people who believe in dualism in their theism. When they think about God, you see that there's good and bad that occurs in the world. So perhaps there's two different deities. There's the God of the good and the God of the bad, which is what ancient beliefs, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, ancient religions believed in that. And there are carryovers of that today in different societies. What's the response to that? The response to that is, think about the sun that shines. You have a person who is working out in the field without a shirt, and their skin turns darker and darker the longer they're out in the noonday sun. And then you think about a person who's hanging a white sheet out or a garment on the clothesline outside, And the longer they leave that object out in the sun, the whiter and more faded it becomes. So you see that sunlight has two opposite effects. It makes skin darker and it makes fabric lighter. How does that work? So the answer is obvious. If you're a chemist, or a biologist, you know the answer. There's, what is it, melanin? Is that what it's called? I know melatonin, I think, is something different. Yeah, there's melanin in the skin, and with the sunlight reacts with the pigmentation of the skin, the chemicals that are in the skin, and that's what makes the skin turn darker. And the sun has a different reaction when it comes to breaking down dark colors that are exposed to sunlight, right? So it's all a chemical reaction having nothing to do with changes in the sun, but rather the recipient. And it's the same idea that we're saying over here. Exactly. Okay, so the most transparent recipient is the Navi, who really just takes in the divine light, is most aware of Hashem's presence in this world, and is able to represent what Hashem has planned for humanity and what Hashem wants from humanity. And the goal is to try and aspire to grow higher and higher to the point where eventually we develop that level of sort of resonance with that divinity to the point where you can feel it, where you can reflect it to the highest degree possible. Okay, good. Ad kan for today in the Kuzari. Let's go on to our Parsha. This is, I'm going to share with you a moment of vulnerable honesty. I am not sure that I know what I'm talking about this morning in our Parsha, but I'm going to share with you what resonates with me in the moment regarding a certain passage that deals with, again, depraved behavior of a society that is about to be destroyed. And I'm talking about the destruction of the people of Sodom, the city of Sodom, and the events that led up to its eventual destruction. After Avraham was unable to successfully argue a defense for the people of Sodom, because Hashem said you won't even find a minion of righteous people in Sodom, Avraham resigns himself to God's decree. And then we read about the story of the actual destruction of the city of Sodom. But the prelude to that is the story of 2 out of the 3 guests that came to Avraham's house, traveling to Sodom. And they know that Avraham has a nephew who lives there. So they go to Lot's residence. Lot runs out to greet them and bows down to them to welcome them in. Vayomer hinena Adonai suruna al beit avdechem. He invites them, please come into my home. I will give you lodging. I'll let you wash and bathe. And then you can sleep the night and then go on your way. They said, no, we'd rather sleep in the street. But Lot puts pressure upon them and finally convinces them to join him in his home. He makes a feast for them. He bakes bread for them. Rashi says it was Pesach, and he makes matzah for them, and they ate. By the way, this is also, the Medrash tells us that Lot's wife was very unhappy. She was not having any of this. She actually went to the neighbors and said, you have any salt? My husband's hocking me a chinik with these guests, and I don't have enough salt in the house to salt the food. And that's how the word got out. It was because of Lot's wife that the word got out. And then we know the aftermath. That's why she turns into a Netziv Melach, a pillar of salt, because of this whole story of the guests coming. And the truth is, the reason why this story is a prelude is because so many things that happen are a result of things reaching a crescendo as a result of these 2 angels coming to visit the city. In other words, we can argue that really the die was only cast after this event that we're about to read about, where Hashem says, all right, that's the straw that broke the camel's back, and now it's time to destroy Sodom. So Terem Yishkavu, so just as they're about to go to bed, ve'anshei ha'ir, anshei Sodom nasabu al habayit minar ve'ad zakein kol ha'am mikatzeh. The people of Sodom surround the house, from young to old, everyone, from one end of the city to the other. Now, it's what Rashi tells us is that it wasn't necessarily the entire city, because there were probably thousands of residents. And so it's unlikely that every single person was around the house. What it more likely means, and by the way, it also seems that only the men came out, the women did not participate. But what you see from here is that no one protested. No one said, there was no righteous person among them who said, what are you doing, you people? Why are you upset with Lot because he's allowed guests to come to his home, despite the rules and regulations of the place of Sodom that we don't allow guests. Vayikru el Lot vayomeru lo. They called out to Lot and they said to him, Ayeh ha'anashim asher bo'u elecha halayla. Where are these men that have come to you under the cover of night? Hotziem eleinu v'neida'a otam. Bring them out for us so that we may know them, right? Which is the euphemism for doing something truly violent with them. Vayetze alehem Lot hapetcha v'hadelet sagar acharav. And Lot walks out and he closes the door behind him. The door is one of the characters in this story. I find that really quite interesting. That the Torah makes a note of saying that he closed the door behind him. And it doesn't say vayisgor et hadelet. It says vehadelet sagar acharav. The door, he closed the door. So it almost seems like there's being some kind of highlight about this door to his home that is plays such a crucial role. And we'll see the door comes back into play in just a minute. Vayomer al no'achai tareu. He says to them, please, my brethren, do not act evil in such an evil way. Hinena li shtei banot. I have two daughters. Asher lo yadu ish. They are virgins. Otziana eten alechem va'asu lahen katov be'einechem. Let me bring them out to you and do with them as you wish. And as the Meforshim point out, he was even allowing them to murder his daughters, if that's what you feel you need to do. Rak la'anashim ha'el al ta'asu davar. All I ask is that you do nothing to these men, ki al kain ba'u b'tzel korati, because they came under my protection. And it would be a great dishonor to them and to me if anything were to happen to them. You think of this as a pretty perverted way of thinking. It's a pretty perverted type of chesed, right? And the Medrash actually tells us that because he treated his daughters as chattel, and sort of something that he could just dispose of if he needed to, that in a way that was most expedient for him, that's the reason why his downfall came through his daughters, through those very same daughters, in the aftermath of the story. And I bolded this response. They said to him, Vayomeru gesh hala. And they said, come over here. And there's different ways of understanding this term gesh hala. Either they meant to say turn aside, or come closer to us. Vayomeru ha'echad balagor vayishpot shafot. They said to him, you've come to live here as a newbie, as a greener. Vayishpot shafot, and now you're trying to judge us? How dare you? We have our own neighborhood norms and standards, and you're the stranger among us, and you want to tell us what the rules ought to be? You want to moralize us? You want to posture yourself as holier than thou? Atan ara lecha mehem. And now we will do worse to you than we do to your guests. Which, to me almost sounds like the story of the Jew. The Jew comes to a foreign land, has a high moral code, and this resentment of, you're our guest, we let you live in our country. You've only been living in Poland for 1,000 years, and you dare tell us how we should live moral lives? You dare to judge? Ata nara lecha mehem, we'll do worse to you than we would do to the guests that don't belong here. Vayiftzuru vayish belot ma'od, and they started to push Lot and push him against the door. Vayigeshu lishbar hadalet, and they were about to break the door. And here again, the door is one of our cast of characters, and why the door is important, I haven't figured it out yet. So you're going to help me put this all together. So if we take a look at Rashi, and Rashi's interpretation, Va'al shahaya meilitz al ha'orchim amru ha'echad balagur, because he was trying to protect his guests, the people of Sodom said to him, you have come just as a stranger. Adam nachri yechidi ata beinenu shabata lagur. You're a stranger among us. You're a greener, and you just came to live here. Vayishpot shafot v'na'aseit mochiach otanu. And now you think that you can rebuke us and tell us what the right thing to do? And here now you see Rashi talking about the delet. And Rashi says, you know what a delet is? Delet hasovevet, the door that rotates, linol v'liftoach, to lock and to open. I have no idea in the world what Rashi is trying to communicate. Rashi doesn't talk about the delet in this way before, but when it talks about how they were trying to break down this door, Rashi tells us, you know what door that we're talking about? It's a door that rotates on a hinge. It moves on a hinge back and forth. Sometimes it locks and sometimes it opens. And that's the door that they wanted to break. Now, what does this speak to you? Let's have a conversation. What does this tell? How does this speak to you? What is the metaphor of the door? Anybody? Well, so Vevet, yes. You could either lock or open. That's the way Rashi says that it revolves. It goes back and forth from being in a locked position to being in an open position, and that's what they wanted to break. Yes.
On one hand, he's trying to protect his guests. On the other hand, he's giving up his daughters. So, like, what's going through his head? Doesn't make sense.
Okay.
Can you repeat some of the discussion? We're not hearing it online.
Yes. So the question is, what is this door that's a revolving door? And Rachel was suggesting that it's reflective of Lot's warped behavior, of his warped morality, that on the one hand he's trying to be moral, but on the other hand he's being immoral by throwing his daughters to the dogs. What else?
I think you had mentioned this in another class. So he is emulating Abraham, who would let the people in from, he'd welcome guests and be very hospitable to them. And he wants to emulate what Abraham was doing at all costs.
Yes. He wanted to emulate Avraham. Now, did Avraham have a door on his tent? Doesn't seem like he had even a door. Now, is that because Avraham just let everybody in? Or is it because he chose a safer place to live? Like if you're living out in the desert, you probably don't need a door, unless there's wild animals. So you need to sort of zip up the tent. But when you're living in Sodom, you definitely need a door, right? So that's actually a very good point, Elaine. Lot perhaps might have believed that he could, by having a door on his house, he knew how to open that door sometimes. He knew how to lock the door sometimes. He knew how to create sort of like this semi-permeable membrane to allow some of Sodom to come into his house, but he also knew how to lock it to make sure that certain elements of Sodom did not enter into his house. And yet, when push came to shove, Sodom is breaking down that door and will not. So when you live in a place like Sodom, it's impossible to control that door. You know, you think as much as you think you can control the door, you can't. Almost like, you know, you give your kids free access to the internet and you tell your kids, turn it on and turn it off, you know, be discreet. And sometimes there's no way to, because it just becomes overwhelming. And they're breaking down the door when you live in Sodom. Rachel, what did you want to say? Yeah, so Lot was trying to moralize the people of Sodom, but his own warped morality also was manifest, like Rachel was saying. Why did he care more about his guests than his daughters? Well, here's something that may shock you, but in the ancient biblical world, females were treated like property. Like I have 5 camels and 3 daughters, you know, I'm a rich man. It's not the way I view my daughter, but I just want to make sure that you understand that. But that would be the simplest understanding, right? Is that and by the way, the Medrash is quite critical of Lot. He says normally a man would do anything to defend the honor of his wife and his daughters. And yet, very backward societies take a very backward view about women. Yeah. Why did Lot continue to live there?
Why did he stay in a place? Otherwise, you know, would he stay in a place that's not good?
Why do people stay in a place that's not good? Does Jewish history shed any light on that? You think? Yeah. Lot must have had merit. Yeah. In other words, the fact that he cared so much about the honor of his guests shows that he learned from his uncle Avraham that there's something honorable about taking in strangers, doing hachnasus orchim.
Can I just tell you a little story? Somebody just told me. I don't know, it's kind of related, but not really. I just heard this actually from a friend of mine. She said her great grandmother, who's in Israel, she's like 4th generation Israeli, was saved. Her life was saved by an Arab. And what happened is that time her husband had died. They were 2 little kids. Died shortly, you know, a few years after they were married, and she ran a little store. And one day, this Arab came to her and said, "You know, you better leave, pack up and leave, because they're going to be attacking and they're going to kill you." So she tried to pack up, but she didn't do it in time. And they started to come with like axes, basically saying, "You know, kill the Jews, kill the Jews."
Mm-hmm.
So this Arab, and she said this is a true story, took her into his house, and in those days, it's like a courtyard. So he took her into the courtyard and locked the gate. And they all came to his thing saying, let her out, send her out, we want her. And she said that with the Arabs, it's like something outside, but if they're in your house, they're protected.
They have sanctuary.
And he said, go away, and she's my guest, and she's staying here.
Mm-hmm.
And they left, and after that, they stayed with them.
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought it was like,
yeah, there are many stories like that. But it sounds like, you know, this type of violent, vicious type of nature still persists in certain cultures. Okay, think about the door. That's one idea. And then I want to show you something really quite interesting that I found in a sefer today. This was written by Rabbi Yitzchak, by Rav Menachem Dov Genak. I believe he's the grandfather of Rabbi Genak of the OU. And he writes as follows, writes something really interesting. The title of this piece is Hatzalatam v'kishlonam shel Noach v'Lot va'amidato b'nisayon shel Avraham. Okay, so the salvation and the downfall or the failure of both Noach and Lot, there's a certain parallel that we can draw between Noach's life and Lot's life. And the door plays a role in this also. And he writes as follows, Amidaktek bilashon hakatuv yireh. If you look carefully at the language of the verses, you'll see shahalashon shenemra bilot domeh lezu shenemra b'Noach, that the Torah uses very similar language in describing this story of Lot and the people of Sodom as in the story of Parshas Noach. Shenemar vayizgor Hashem ba'ado, that God closed the ark door for Noach. And you also see this same idea. It says, Vayishlechu anashim et yadam. It says that when the men were trying to break the door down, the angels sent out their hands. They brought in Lot into the house, ve'et hadelet sagaru, and they closed the door. So it's this. There's a closing of a door in both stories. In the story of Noach being saved on the ark, and the door of Lot's house. If you look at Rashi in his commentary to Noach, God closing the ark door, it says Hegin alav shelo yishberuha, that God protected Noach to make sure that the people outside the ark would not break down the door. Like, they would come with their pickaxes and they would start to hack away at the ark. That would have been a disaster, right? So Hekif hateva dovim va'arayot v'hayu hargim bahem. So what did Hashem do? He positioned lions and tigers all around the ark, and they sort of attacked anyone who tried to approach the ark. Shekamo shehigin Hashem al hateva shelo yishberu et dalta likanes bifnim. Just like God protected the ark door to make sure that no one could penetrate, Kain gam eitzalot heginu hamalachim alot shelo yiftzeru anshei Sodom lishbor adelet. So too did these angels protect Lot, and then they were afflicted with blindness so that they would not be able to find the door. Right? They couldn't find the door. That's part of the story. As a matter of fact, if you take a look back at the story, they closed the door. Ve'et ha'anashim asher petach habayit, the people who were at the entrance of the house, Yiku basan verim mikaton va'ad gadol. They were afflicted with blindness, all of them, from the young to the old. Vayil'u limtso hapatach. They couldn't find the opening. Now, notice how that major character of our story, Delet, changes its name to Petach. What's the difference between a Delet and a Petach? Isn't that interesting? Petach is an opening, is a portal. It's a portal. Well, a door has a petach. A door closes a petach. So a delet, like Rashi says, linol v'liftoach, it has the function of both closing the entry and opening the entry. But the petach is the way in. They couldn't.
Now an opening.
Well, maybe it's a deeper metaphor for this. Their blindness was an indication that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. This anger, their refusal to even listen to Lot, to try to be reasoned with, meant that they could no longer, they were totally blind, and they could no longer find an entry back to come back inside the enclave of humanity. Maybe that's what this is really all about. But in any event, you see the parallel between Noach and Lot. Okay, so that's one point. He says, "Gam sipur hatzalat Lot mistom domeh lezeh shel Noach." We can also compare how Lot was saved in the same way that Noach was saved from the flood. B'mabul hishmid Hashem kol chai mishum rishat ha'olam, v'raket mishpachat Noach hitzil. In the flood, God destroys the entire world, and only Noach and his family are saved. V'chein b'hafichat Sodom hitzil Hashem et Lot v'et mishpachto, v'et Sodom v'amora henish v'hishmid. And the same thing, the same parallel is that God destroys the entire culture of Sodom, the entire city, this time with fire and brimstone instead of a flood. But it's the same idea that Lot and his family are saved. V'gam kan anu motzim lashon makbila. We see a similar parallel language. Bistom va'amora ksiv v'Hashem himtir al Sodom va'al amora gofrit va'esh me'et Hashem min hashamayim. The language in our parsha is that God rained down upon Sodom and Amorah fire and brimstone from God from heaven. Uvimabul k'tiv, and think about what it says by the Mabul. Anochi mamtir al haaretz. Behold, I, says God, am going to rain down upon the earth. Arba'im yom ve'arba'im laila, 40 days and 40 nights. So the same verb, lehamtir, which is to cause something to fall from heaven. Matar, right? What is matar? Matar is rainfall. So the same verb of lehamtir is used for both the fire and brimstone falling from the sky and the water falling from the sky to bring the flood. Very interesting. Okay, next. Bihine sipur Noach achar hamabul makbil lazeh shalot. Finally, the aftermath of Lot being saved from the destruction of Sodom, there's a parallel to what the aftermath of Noach being saved from the flood. So he says, "B'tkufa shacharei hamabul." Right after the flood, what does Noach do? What does Noach do after the flood? Plants a vineyard and gets drunk. Nata Noach kerem v'shata yain vayishkar. And then his son Cham does something sexually deviant to Noach, according to Chazal. When it says he uncovered his nakedness, it means something that's a euphemism for something worse. And the same thing is in the aftermath of Lot. He gets drunk and his daughters consort with him. So it's like the child violating the parent, uncovering the nakedness of the parent through intoxication in both stories. Really interesting parallel. Harei shalot lo lamad mikishlono shel Noach v'nichshal ba'oto davar shabo nichshal Noach. When you look at it that way, apparently whatever failure Noach had after the flood, Lot did not learn from that failure, and he too failed in some way. We normally think about, why did Noach get drunk after the Mabul? Which was not immediately after the Mabul. I mean, it takes time. It takes a whole season for grapes to grow, and then you have to ferment the grapes when you turn it into wine. This didn't happen 5 minutes after he gets off the teva, even though the psukim seem to indicate that. It probably took a year. But when you think about the nihilism that Noach must have been experiencing internally about seeing a completely destroyed world, nothing is left from his old world. There's desolation everywhere. And it's a means of escape, right? To try and find some escape from the devastation that he's experienced. And perhaps that's what caused Lot to want to become so readily submit himself to the intoxication of wine, right? And yet, as a result, he's disgraced by his offspring, okay? Ad sheba Avraham Avinu shenatal schar kulam v'halach b'derech Hashem. And this perhaps is an indication that Avraham really had to sort of be the rectifier of this prevailing and persistent attitude in mankind to sort of give up on humanity and to say, I've seen the worst in humanity. I've seen the devastation that humanity has to undergo in order to rectify their evil. So what's the point? What can I possibly do? That's the attitude of both Noach and Lot. And Avraham takes the optimistic view. Their evil exists, and there are always going to be people who are going to try to break down the door. But we have to move, we have to soldier forward. We have to be able to say that despite the persistence of evil in the world, we cannot succumb to that evil and just throw up our hands in despair and say, what's the point? It's useless. No matter how much light we try to shine upon the world, the evil ones are always going to be waving their Palestinian flags. Okay? We can't allow ourselves to succumb to that kind of attitude of nihilism and that there's no point in all of this. That no matter how much we try to be a moral people, to shine a light on the world, to sort of refract that light that we started with, the world is still going, this world is not going to learn. They're going to tell the Jews, just drop dead. Okay? But that's not, we can't give up. We have to persist. Okay, you're helping me write my drasha. Okay, go ahead. It's uncanny how blind they are. It's uncanny how the blindness, they just fail to see the preciousness of a life just because we're the Jewish people. They don't see the importance of our lives in the same way that they perceive the lives of others. See, the Jewish people always perceive all human life as being infinitely precious. All life is precious, whether it's a Palestinian or an Arab or whether it's a Jew. And that's why even when we have to go to war, we work our best to try to minimize casualties, right? And the fact that there are more casualties allegedly now in Gaza than we wanted and we expected is probably due to Hamas. Hamas is not letting people get away. They want more people to die. Because they want to implicate the Jewish people.
They have a great PR system. So, revolving door and being in the wrong place. So now people are saying we should all go to Israel. Is that what we should do? Should all people go to Israel? Because and as you were saying, we're supposed to give light out. Are we supposed to be here to give light out?
Right. So the question is, are we supposed to stay here to keep shining a light in the diaspora? Or should we bring the light home with us?
Close our door.
Do we close the door? Well, the door only has to be closed when you're in Sodom. You don't have to close the door when you're among holy people, when you're among good people. You have to keep the evil out. So I don't know what to tell you as far as when it's time for every individual to make that decision to go back to Israel. But I will tell you this, the Netziv has a fascinating commentary that I've quoted a number of times before. He says, when the Jews sinned with the sin of the spies, and they were consigned to have to wander in the desert for 40 years, but part of that punishment was that they would eventually have to go into Gullus. They would eventually be exiled from their land. So he says, what would have happened had we never sinned? And we would have gone straight into Eretz Yisrael and would have stayed there. And there never would have been an exile, a Babylonian exile, a Roman exile. How would the world have known about Judaism? How would the light of the Jewish people gotten out into the world? And he answers that light can travel if it's strong enough. Even if you have one localized part of the world that has that light, if the light is strong enough, it can travel and permeate the entire world. Had the Jewish people not diminished themselves, we could have all been in Eretz Yisrael and our light would have spread far beyond our borders. But when we sinned, our light was not strong enough to extend geographically across the world. And therefore, we had to go into Galus so that our light could shine to all the different parts of the world, to all different areas, to societies that are very, very far away from Eretz Yisrael. But there does come a time when we have to say, okay, our Abba is calling us to come back home. We've shined the light for a long time. Now it's time to come home to Abba. So I'm not sure whether now's the time or whether another few years is going to be the time. That's for every individual to decide for themselves.
Financially and spiritually in every which way. And I guess you have to have the toughness that could manage.
I got news for you. Israel is not as financially dependent on the Jews of the diaspora as they once were. There is a tremendous amount of individual wealth in Israel today that rivals the wealth of many people, many Jews in the diaspora. So you're right. We were speaking 50 years ago, the bonds appeal, the Israel bonds appeal sounded one way 50 years ago when, they needed us financially because there was tremendous poverty. But we're the startup nation. Technology that we have and the advances that we've made financially as well are really quite remarkable. So yes, we got to send our money to Eretz Yisrael, especially now because of the needs there. But if we were all to make Aliyah, we would figure out, I think a lot of us would, you have to go with a financial plan. You can't be irresponsible. But if we go with a financial plan, we'll be able to make it work. Okay, I'm blabbering on, so I think it's time for us to stop. I think there's enough content here for us to be able to take with us. There's a door that sometimes is open and sometimes is closed. And the door, for some strange reason, changes its name to a petach in the middle of our story. We're going to have to develop that idea further. And also we learned about the door on Noach's Teva, that it too was in danger of being broken down until Hashem protected the door from being broken. Sometimes the door has to be broken. We also learned about the similarity between Lot and Noach in not learning the proper lesson in the aftermath of all of the destruction. We can't give up on humanity. We have to be more like Avraham. So with all of those ideas, I'm going to send you on your way, and we'll see you Bezrat Hashem in 2 weeks from today. And everyone,
Thank you, Rabbi.
take care.
Thank you.